Hi, welcome back to another Truth Outreach program that gives you a comparison of the teachings of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, or the Mormons, to Christianity. And of course, the foundation that we use for that is the good old Bible, the Bible, Basic Instruction Before Leaving Earth. I'm Rocky Hulse.
And I'm Helen Hulse. Rocky and I are the founders of Mormon Missions Midwest Outreach, and we welcome you again to another program of Truth Outreach.
Well, today is the final. It's part 4 of a 4-part series that we have been doing on the anti-black doctrine. And very important that we always do on this program is provide a couple of quotes up front, which we believe authorizes us to do what we do. The first one is from Brigham Young. It says, "I say to the whole world, receive the truth, no matter who presents it to you. Take up the Bible, compare the religion of the Latter-day Saints with it, and see if it will stand the test." His first counselor was George A. Smith, and George A. said, "If a faith will not bear to be investigated, if its preachers and professors are afraid to have it examined, their foundation must be very weak." Those quotes are very important, always are very important for what we do on this show, but even more so because this 4-part series that we've been doing on the Mormon anti-black doctrine is very controversial, it's very inflammatory. But those quotes tell non-Mormons and Mormons alike to whoever provides you the truth to accept it. And we're providing the truth, and we're documenting everything that we say here.
What they were doing was challenging Christians.
Back then, sure.
They were challenging Christians that Mormonism was true, and for them to prove them wrong. And when we're just using those quotes because, I think it validates what we do. Mm-hmm. Now, this is part 4. This is program number 60 that we are doing, but this is part 4 of a 4-part series on the Mormon anti-black doctrine. Now, the first part that we did 3 weeks ago was on the history of this doctrine. Part 2 was the doctrine itself. Part 3 was the contradictions between the stated doctrine and then the change that alleviated it and shows the contradictions in it. And what we're going to do today is called the denial, because the Mormon Church today is denying their past, denying the history of this doctrine, and denying the position that they held for over 140 years. Now, I want to repeat what I've said each week with relation to this series, and that is that there are parts of what are going to be said, and especially today, there are some very inflammatory statements that I am going to make today. But they're not my statements. They're quotes from Mormon apostles and Mormon prophets. And they're not my statements either.
And they're not Helen's statements either, okay? We're just presenting to you. We're just the messengers. Don't get mad at us. No. We're just presenting the truth, and because it needs to be told. It needs to be seen.
Sure. Because it's not going to be many generations before the old teachings of this anti-black is passed away, and people will not remember. They won't know the truth unless it's presented.
So we've covered the history behind the anti-black doctrine. We've covered the doctrine itself, promoted by the Mormon Church and its leaders from Joseph Smith, the founder of Mormonism, through each of the successive Mormon prophets and their respective 12 apostles, and that's 10 additional Mormon prophets and their councils of the 12, up to the 12th Mormon prophet, Spencer W. Kimball. Now, on June the 8th, 1978, the Mormon prophet Spencer W. Kimball reversed the doctrinal position the church had taken since the mid-1830s. And he allowed blacks to hold the Mormon priesthood and to go to the Mormon temple to complete the rituals that they call endowments that they believe will allow them to become gods in the next life. Now, we looked at the contradictions between all the previous Mormon prophets and a large majority of Mormon apostles to this revelation in June of 78 that allowed the blacks to hold the priesthood. Now, those contradictions in and of themselves prove that the Mormon Church is not led by divinely inspired prophets and apostles, but it's simply led by sinful men. Now, what Helen's got right here, this is a church news. Now, this is the church news of May the 31st, 2003. Now, the church news is published by the Deseret News paper company, which is owned by the Mormon Church. Now, the cover on the front of that has, let me stick my finger over there, it's got these two Mormon missionaries, and you can tell they're Mormon missionaries. They got the little black name tags on there, and they're two black men, and they're walking down this trail there, and you can tell because of their white shirts and that they're Mormon missionaries. Now the cover says right here, and I'll put it up for on this graphic on the screen. It says, 25 years since priesthood revelation. The long-promised day has come when every faithful, worthy man in the church may receive the holy priesthood. Now this is an official declaration too from the Doctrine and Covenants. Now denial and deceit by the Mormon Church of this anti-black doctrine appears to be the way of avoiding facing reality that this anti-black doctrine proves that Mormonism is a false religion. Now that front cover of the Church News that Helen just held up, under the picture of the two black Mormon missionaries says, and we already put it up there, but it says, the long-promised day has come. Now that statement perpetuates the lie that the Mormon Church is putting forward to hide the truth of this anti-black doctrine. That statement ignores history. That statement insinuates that the previous Mormon prophets all prophesied that a day would come. And that's true. They did prophesy that a day would come when the blacks could hold the priesthood. But that day, they all said or agreed with the position of previous prophets, is in the next life, after the resurrection, not in this life on this world. The 10th Mormon prophet, Joseph Fielding Smith, who served as a prophet until he died in 1972, wrote a series of books called Answers to Gospel Questions. In volume 2 of that series, he answered a question concerning when the Negroes will be allowed to receive the priesthood. Now here's the answer that he gave. This is by 10th Mormon prophet Joseph Fielding Smith. His answer is, quote, the Lord decreed that the children of Cain should not have the privilege of bearing the priesthood until Abel had posterity. Who could have the priesthood, and that will have to be in the far distant future, when this is accomplished on some other world. Then the restrictions will be removed from the children of Cain who have been true to their second estate. And the second estate in Mormonism is earth life. The first estate was pre-existence. Earth life is the second estate. So this 10th Mormon prophet right here says that they can't hold the priesthood until the far distant future on another world. So,
not this one.
And this prophet held this doctoral position 6 years prior to the 12th prophet, because he died in 72, and then in 1978, the 12th Mormon prophet, Kimball, changed the anti-black doctrine. So as we've already seen in this series, Mormon prophets and apostles are God's oracles on earth. And I'm going to review that with you right now because it's very important that you see that. So let's put it up on the screen. This is out of the Mormon, and that's the manual you got right there. This is out of this Teachings of the Living Prophets student manual, Religion 333, which was from Brigham Young, one of the Brigham Young classes on religion. That here's the quote. Although the church has many men who serve as general authorities, only the first presidency and the members of the quorum of the 12 apostles are sustained as prophets, seers, and revelators. That was on page 8. Now we're going to go down to page 9. It should be in mind that some of the general authorities have assigned to them a special calling. They possess a special gift. They are sustained as prophets, seers, and revelators, which gives them a special spiritual endowment in connection with their teaching the people. Look at this last sentence, so important. They, the Mormon apostles and prophets, they have the right, the power, and authority to declare the mind of and will of God to his people. And who are his people? Mormons. Okay? So, now wait a minute here. Okay, Oracle number 10, Joseph Fielding Smith, and all previous oracles back to number 1, Joseph Smith, say that the blacks will not be allowed to hold the priesthood until after the resurrection in another world. But oracle number 12 comes along and reverses the doctrine. Now, one of the oracles has to be wrong. The 13th prophet of the church, now this was after Kimball, so this is the guy that followed Kimball. The 13th prophet of the Mormon Church, Ezra Taft Benson, gave a speech at BYU on February 26, 1980. This was after the revelation that changed it in 78. So in 1980, he gives this speech, and he says, this speech was called The 14 Fundamentals in Following the Prophets. Now let me quote from the speech concerning the fourth fundamental in following the prophet. And here it is. I'll put it up on the screen. The fourth fundamental is the prophet will never lead the church astray. Now he continues in this quote here. I'm going to continue. This is where he gets this information from. President Wilford Woodruff stated, now President Wilford Woodruff was the fourth Mormon prophet. And he's quoting him. He says, Wilford stated, I say to Israel, who's Israel? Mormons. I say to Israel, the Lord will never permit me or any other man who stands as president of the church to lead you astray. It is not in the program. It is not in the mind of God. Now he goes on and quotes another. This is President Marion G. Romney, who was one of the counselors at the time that this quote was done. Okay, and this was first counselor to Kimball. So this is, again, this presidency, President Romney, and he says, I remember years ago, this is Romney speaking, when I was a bishop, I had President Heber J. Grant. Now, President Heber J. Grant was the sixth Mormon prophet. I had President Heber J. Grant talk to our ward. After the meeting, I drove him home. Standing by me, he put his arm over my shoulder and said, my boy, you always keep your eye on the president of the church. And if he ever tells you to do anything, and it is wrong, and you do it, the Lord will bless you for it. Then with a twinkle in his eye, he said, but you don't need to worry. The Lord will never let his mouthpiece lead the people astray. So what we see here is that the Mormon Church teaches that these men are the oracles of God on earth. You know, he says the mouthpiece, that the president of the church is the mouthpiece for God directly. They have the right, the power and authority to declare the mind and the will of God, and that the Lord will never permit them to lead you astray. Well, to quote a famous line from the movie Apollo 13, Houston, we have a problem. Someone here is leading someone astray, because the Mormon Church can't have it both ways. The 12th Mormon prophet cannot come along and reverse what 11 other Mormon prophets have all stated directly or indirectly was God's law. Either they were all wrong and led the church astray, or number 12 is leading the church astray, and those that have followed him, because no one's changed it. So which is it? What did Jesus say to his apostles? I'm going to put that up. This is the Bible speaking. This is what Jesus said. This is Mark 16:15. And he said unto them, go ye into all the world and preach the gospel to every creature.
That doesn't mean Mormonism.
No, that's the Bible. That's Jesus speaking. And the gospel is the good news, Jesus Christ and him crucified. That's the gospel.
Good preaching.
It is good preaching. Because that's what Paul said. Go to 1 Corinthians chapter 15, the first 4 verses. That's the gospel that Paul preached. Jesus Christ and him crucified. That's the gospel. Period.
Absolutely.
Okay? Now, what was the Mormon Church's doctrinal position up until June the 8th, 1978? In the book Mormon Doctrine, and that's right there. Have Helen hold that up. That's the Mongol book.
If I can lift it.
That's Mormon Doctrine by Mormon Apostle Bruce R. McConkie. Turn it edgewise so you can see how thick that thing is. Okay? This is the position I'm going to quote from this book by Mormon Apostle, who is an oracle. Mormon Apostle Bruce R. McConkie, who's one of the oracles of God on earth. This is what he said. This is the Mormon position prior to 1978. Negroes in this life are denied the priesthood. Under no circumstances can they hold this delegation of authority from the Almighty. And he quotes Mormon scripture there, the book of Abraham. This is not from the Bible. This is from Mormon, the Pearl of Great Price, which is Mormon.
Mormon scriptures.
Abraham chapter 1, verses 20 and 27. The message of the gospel, and that's Mormonism, the message of the gospel, Mormonism, is not carried affirmatively to them. Now, Jesus, as we just saw in Mark, said, "Go ye into all the world and preach the gospel to every creature." Yet the Mormons come back up until 1978 and say the message of the gospel is not carried to the Negroes. So let's look at the utter hypocrisy that the Mormon Church is putting forth today. A complete denial of God's law taught in their past. An article in the June 1990 Ensign magazine. I got that right.
You got it right this time.
See, when I grew up in the church, we called it the Ensign. But today they say the name of the magazine is Ensign. The official magazine of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints is the Ensign magazine. In an article in the June 1990 Ensign magazine, it was titled "A Hike to Eternity," just shows the absolute denial of Mormonism about their racist doctrine. The article tells of a mixed-race family that lived below the Oakland, California temple. Now, this temple is built up on the side of a hill, and so let me quote from this article. It says, "We had lived just below the Oakland temple for more than a year, but we had never gone near it. We were an interracial family, and though we had heard the Mormons now allowed blacks to hold the priesthood, we were certain we wouldn't be welcome there. Besides, we really weren't interested in going anywhere near a church with such a well-known image of discrimination against blacks. Michael, I don't think we'd better go there," I said. "Besides, I said, Mormons don't like blacks, and they especially don't like mixed families." Now, the story continues that they do take a hike up the mountain, and they end up at the temple, and they sneak into this tour group at the temple, and the Mormons that are leading the tour group are so nice to them, and one thing leads to another, and they take the Mormon missionary lessons, and they join the Mormon church. Now, the article concludes with this last paragraph, and I'm going to put it up for a couple of slides for you on the screen. It says, "In the intervening decade, our family's hike to eternity has carried us halfway around the world and back again to our present home in Oregon. We've taken some wrong turns and detours along the way, and some of the trail has been rough. But in our wanderings, we have never found hide nor hair of the racism we had worried about. What we have found is a world filled with the Bodines and Nelsons," and this was a couple of families that were in this story, "church member co-hikers who are always ready to reacquaint us with the map and put us back on the right path to eternity." Now, that's the story that the Mormons, interracial family, welcomed into the church, you know, no discrimination, no racism. Well, this article, you know, just perpetuates the lie that the Mormon church has never been racist and fully accepts mixed-race marriages. But what did Brigham Young say about mixed-race marriages? Here's the quote. This is Brigham Young. He said, "Shall I tell you the law of God in regard to the African race? If the white man who belongs to the chosen seed mixes his blood with the seed of Cain, the penalty under the law of God is death on the spot. This will always be so." Wow. Do you see the deception? The Mormon church is in this utter denial of its past. You know, you can say, well, men of other Christian churches made racial statements over the years.
And they did.
And you're absolutely right. They did, okay? I'm not denying that Christian leaders through the years have not made discriminatory racial statements. I'm not denying that, okay? However, the Mormon church says that its leaders are God's oracles on earth, and that they have, quote, the right, the power, and authority to declare the mind and will of God. and that the Lord will never permit them to lead you astray. Now, no one else says that. The Baptist leaders aren't those statements are not made of them, or the Methodist, the Lutheran, the Presbyterian, the Episcopalians, Assembly of God, Grace Bible Church, independent churches. No one makes that claim about their leadership. But the Mormons do. They say they are the direct oracles speaking the mind and the will of God.
They put down all other Christian churches for not having prophets and
exactly.
apostles.
They say that they have direct leadership from God. And the quotes that we've been giving you in these last 4 shows and today come directly from those men. Mm-hmm. Now, in an interview with Look magazine, which was on October the 22nd of 1963, the 10th Mormon prophet Joseph Fielding Smith, an oracle of God and the 10th Mormon prophet, made this very, very racial statement. I would not want you to believe that we bear any animosity toward the Negro. Darkies are wonderful people, and they have their place in our church. The 3rd Mormon prophet, John Taylor, said blacks were the devil's representative on earth. This is the 3rd Mormon prophet, who is an oracle and speaks the mind and will of God. This is what he said. After the flood, we are told that the curse that had been pronounced upon Cain was continued through Ham's wife, as he had married a wife of that seed. And why did it pass through the flood? Because it was necessary that the devil should have a representative upon the earth as well as God. So here's another inflammatory, racial, degrading statement made by an oracle of God.
Well, he's saying that's what God said.
Yes, absolutely.
Okay. I mean, that's what you really need to make clear, is that they are saying that that is what God said through them.
Yep. Now, the last couple have been from the 10th Mormon prophet and the 3rd Mormon prophet. Now here's the 2nd Mormon prophet, Brigham Young. This is what he said. You see some classes of the human family that are black, uncouth, uncomely, disagreeable, and low in their habits, wild and seemingly deprived of nearly all the blessings of the intelligence that is generally bestowed upon mankind. And Brigham Young's first counselor, George A. Smith, he said this: there is not a man from the President of the United States to the editors of their sanctorums, clear down to the low-bred letter writers in this territory, but would rob the coppers from a dead nigger's eyes if they had a good opportunity. Now, Mormonism today promotes this story that the church was opposed to slavery and that they were never, bigoted and racial and whatever. Not true. Joseph Smith himself said the church was opposed to setting the Negroes free. I'm going to put that quote up for you on the screen. This is what Joseph Smith said. This is out of the history of the church. He said, and what he's doing was answering questions, and this was question number 13. Are the Mormons abolitionists? No, unless delivering the people from priestcraft and the priests from the power of Satan should be considered abolition. But we do not, you reading this last sentence, but we do not believe in setting the Negroes free. That is not what the Mormon church is saying today. They're saying, oh, we've never been, we've always been against slavery, and we've never. That's baloney. Here, the quotes are right there for you. The Mormon church today is so deceitful about its position on slavery in the past. In an article in the church's official magazine, The Ensign, April 1996, titled Shepherding in Mississippi's Jackson Stake, under the subheading, No Prejudice Within These Walls, we see the deception. I'm going to put it up for you. More than a century ago, the United States was ripped apart over the issue of slavery. But today, the restored gospel continues to be a healing balm. Now, the restored gospel is Mormonism. Continues to be a healing balm and force for mutual understanding and unity among members of all races and backgrounds. They attend church together, worshiping and learning about love, service, and Heavenly Father's plan for them. Now, that is what, that statement makes you think, this continues to be a healing balm like they've been doing it all along. Not so. Brigham Young, in an interview with the abolitionist Horace Greeley, who was the editor of the New York Tribune, in Salt Lake City on June 13, 1859, said this. Horace Greeley asked him a question. What is the position of your church with respect to slavery? Brigham Young answers, we consider it of divine institution, and not to be abolished until the curse pronounced on Ham shall have been removed from his descendants. Horace Greeley continues, asks him another question. Are there slaves now held in this territory? Now remember, this is 1859. Brigham Young says, there are. Horace Greeley, do your territorial laws uphold slavery? Brigham Young's answer, those laws are printed. You can read them for yourself. Now, what I have right here, this is a copy. Can't really see it very well in the glare.
But you have it.
But this is a copy of the territorial laws, the act organizing the territory of Utah, dated 1852. Beginning on page 80 and running through page, begins on page 80 and runs through page 82, which is called An Act in Relation to Service, which lays out slavery in Utah. And it's right here in black and white. Of all of the western states in the history of the United States, none of them allowed slavery. Not California, not Oregon, not Washington, not Arizona, not New Mexico. None of the western territories allowed slavery except Utah. And it's right here. Brigham Young was the governor. Every member of their territorial Senate and House were all Mormons, and they enacted slavery. It's the only state. Yet Mormonism denies that today. Oh, we were always against slavery. Baloney. That's not true. It's a lie. And they're perpetuating the lie today. Mormonism was a religion and is a religion based on prejudice. Just because they changed the doctrine in 1978 and allow Mormons now to hold, or blacks to hold the Mormon priesthood, doesn't change their doctrine of pre-existence where the blacks are cursed and punished for what they did in the pre-existence. It's there. Wow, 10 seconds left. This show went fast. It's a 4-part series. It's the truth. Mormonism is a false doctrine.